Intended to tide over audiences awaiting a true original 3D Sonic adventure on the Sega Saturn, Sonic R ultimately ended up as one of the closest things fans would ever come to one. Desperate to fill a gap in their 1997 holiday lineup, Sega handed their mascot over to Traveller's Tales. The result was an unconventional on-foot racer with an upbeat Europop soundtrack. But how did such a departure from the traditional installments of Sega's biggest platforming series come to be? Chasing up former staff and scanning through the wealth of information carefully archived by sites like Sonic Retro, I've been piecing together the story behind Sonic R. Join me as I go back in time to another world when Sega was still trying to change the Saturn's fortunes. The original concept of a Sonic racing game is known to have come from Yuji Naka, one of the major creative forces behind Sonic, who served as lead programmer on each of the early main series titles. Naka had always been interested in doing an on-foot racing game with Sonic characters. The competitive mode in Sonic 2, which offered split-screen racing for 2 players, was one early exploration of this idea. After that, he still intended to one day make a separate spin-off game around it, and when the Saturn's lineup was in need of support, the ideal opportunity for it presented itself. Naka's original intention was to have Sonic Team themselves develop it. However, they had since become otherwise engaged creating a Saturn collection of Sonic's Mega Drive outings called Sonic Jam. Sega instead turned to a small developer in Knutsford, England. Traveller's Tales had first caught Sega's attention with their Mega Drive version of the Toy Story tie-in video game. Impressed with this effort, Yuji Naka had personally recommended them for a potential collaboration. The result was Sonic 3D Blast for the Mega Drive and Saturn, a platformer that offered a different take on the hedgehog with an isometric camera perspective. Sega was sufficiently pleased with their work on this title that they were already considering them for another future Sonic project before the end of its development. When Sega eventually chose Traveller's Tales for their Sonic racing game, however, they were already underway on another project for them. I spoke to John Burton, Sonic R's lead programmer and the founder of Traveller's Tales, who recounted what happened. The developers at TT had been creating their own engine, designed specifically to be used for racing games on the Saturn. They had struck a deal to develop a Formula 1 game exclusively for the Saturn, which was set to be published by Sega themselves. This was intended to compete with the 1996 PS1 Formula 1 game by Bizarre Creations, which had been a booming financial success. The TT Formula 1 project was a few months into pre-production when in early 1997, Sega decided to apply the brakes on it. The long-awaited Sonic X-treme, once supposed to be Sega's flagship 3D Sonic platformer for the Saturn, had been cancelled. It left Sega scrambling to fill a blue hedgehog-shaped hole in their holiday lineup. Taking Yuji Naka's suggestion, they signed a new contract with Traveller's Tales, permitting them to retrofit their Formula 1 project into a Sonic racer. Development began in around February 1997, during which time it was known as Sonic TT. References to this title can be found in the game's source code. John Burton told me that this was a nod not only to Traveller's Tales, but to racing terms like Time Trial and Taurus Trophy. Sega initially signaled that they liked the idea, but later chose to change it after a couple of months to Sonic R. According to an interview conducted in early 1997 with a Sega spokesperson, quote, "The R stands for many different things and not just racing. It is up to the player to decide exactly what." Due to Sega being based in Japan, the game was subject to a transcontinental development. Characters and levels were sketched out by Japanese staff and sent over to Traveller's Tales in England for them to model and program. In the case of the racetracks, they were quite literally sketched out on paper. Sega's artists sent Traveller's Tales actual paper drawings of the map layouts for them to adapt. Sega's primary liaison with Traveller's Tales was a producer named Kat Sato, who spent development on site in England. Since internet infrastructure in the UK was in its infancy, Sato spent a significant amount of time in expensive long-distance phone calls to Japan discussing the game's design in order to accurately relay their instructions. According to Sato, he formed a good relationship with the team at Traveller's Tales and became close personal friends with John Burton, to the point at which he attended his wedding during the development of Sonic R. Yuji Naka also paid the studio a visit, John Burton told me. Yuji Naka did visit the studio in person. In fact, we had dinner with him at a local Italian restaurant. I remember the restaurant had paper tablecloths at the time, and it was for people to doodle on during dinner. Yuji drew a Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon on the tablecloth, and I remember afterwards wishing I'd taken it with us instead of leaving it there. I also met him again in Japan. We had a meeting and dinner, I think. I remember he parked his Sonic Blue Porsche 911 in one of those vending machine car parks they have in Japan. I'd never seen parking like that before. By March 14th, 1997, the developers had put together an early first prototype for the game, which John Burton later labelled 0.1. Retrofitting some of the work done on their Formula 1 game, this essentially acted as a first run at demonstrating the technology that would power Sonic R. The user could guide the camera on a fixed track through a metallic blue racecourse, complete with Sonic and Robotnik Easter eggs in the background, and in true Sonic fashion, a loop-de-loop. The environment seen in 0.1 was made for internal purposes, and never appeared in later builds. 3 weeks later, however, the team was starting to realise the first level that would make it into the release game. Shared by John Burton in 2017 on YouTube, version 0.2 features a very early resort island. Like the previous prototype, it can only be controlled by maneuvering down a predetermined line, but it offers us a glimpse into what was and what had yet to be at this early phase. Multiple Sonic models glide down the track, an early test of multiple characters before other character models had been built in. The level featured a clearly very different skybox. This was actually a placeholder used for test purposes, which originated from another Traveller's Tales game, 1994's Mickey Mania. It was taken from the background of the Moose Hunters level, based on the classic Disney short of the same name. Another noteworthy fixture of this build is a metallic Sonic model floating throughout the course. This was implemented to test reflection mapping on characters during gameplay, but the Saturn, with its limited capabilities, was unable to support it, according to John Burton. The effect was instead reserved for other parts of the game, such as the rotating R on the title screen and the reflective Sonic head seen during loading. Sonic R's art, by all accounts, evolved considerably over the course of its creation, and was initially intended to feature a style much closer to Sonic 3D Blast. Resort Island, for example, once included foliage textures that were identical to those seen in 3D Blast, but this direction was later abandoned. The following prototype, 0.3 from May 2nd in 1997, marks the first demo to be shown to Sega. By this point, the player had more direct control over Sonic. We can start to see the beginning of the game's innovative fading technology to mask its draw distance, and the rings now had collision programmed, meaning they could be collected. The ring gates, on the other hand, which players can unlock by collecting a certain amount of rings, had yet to be put in place. Sonic could instead freely walk through the cave, where one would later be added. This build shows us another unused skybox as well, one including a sun setting over a mountain range. As it turns out, this background was intended to be used in the game until fairly late on. Sonic R was previewed by a myriad of different publications in the run-up to launch, and this evening variant of Resort Island was included in many of them. It appears to have been present in the game until sometime in summer of 1997. John Burton has explained the very simple rationale behind its removal. Upon listening to Can You Feel the Sunshine, the track's musical theme, it dawned upon John how out of place the background felt in consideration of its lyrics. It was therefore altered to be set during the middle of the day, so players could truly feel the aforementioned sunshine. The game made its official public debut at E3 in June 1997. A trailer circulated at the time claimed it was 20% completed. Builds with an early version of Resort Island were playable on the show floor to attendees, and the developers took this opportunity to closely observe the reactions of players. One valuable piece of feedback gathered from this experience relates to the water which flows throughout the level. John Burton said that in these prototypes, falling into the lake would slow the player down significantly, making it hard for them to recover in the competition. People sampling the demo would often abandon their play sessions entirely when this happened, quickly losing interest and walking away from the kiosks. When the team returned from E3 that year, John therefore made it a priority to speed up movement when underwater, making it less daunting and easier for players to regain their footing in the race. As others tell it, however, Sonic R garnered some very negative reactions at E3, causing considerable concern at Sega. Hirokazu Yasuhara, who is best known for being the lead designer on the original 2D Sonic games, spoke candidly about this in a 2003 interview with Game Informer. He revealed that he was drafted in mid-development to revamp its level design. Sega asked me to work with Traveler's Tales. Sonic R had received awful reviews at E3, and Sega wanted me to improve it. I was asked to help out, even though I was not working on Sonic games anymore. Sonic R was promoted by Sega as part of a multi-game marketing strategy called Project Sonic. The goal of this label was to advertise Sonic Saturn titles and to boost the franchise's profile in Japan. Phase 1 of Project Sonic was Sonic Jam, while Sonic R became Phase 2. By all accounts, it was shown to journalists not only at E3 but behind closed doors numerous times in the months after. It's in these previews that we can see more cuts and changes made on the road to release. The character icons seen on the left of the HUD featured different art, similar in appearance to the item boxes from 2D Sonic games. They were later redone and given new black backgrounds. The ring gates in Resort Island originally required a far higher amount of rings to pass through. One, for instance, needed as many as 100 rings, whereas the same gate in the Finish game asks for half that amount. The mini-map seen in the bottom right of the screen in the Finish game is noticeably missing from these prototypes, although one was always intended to be added later, it simply had yet to be implemented. Sonic R was prominently featured in the UK's Sega Saturn magazine, and it was in the August 1997 issue that they showed off a power-up which was ultimately destined for the cutting room floor. The game was originally intended to include the 3 element shields introduced in Sonic the Hedgehog 3, the Bubble Shield, the Lightning Shield, and the Flame Shield, and it was the last of those which was subject to removal. Like its appearance in Sonic 3, the Flame Shield essentially functioned as a buffer against attacks and would be extinguished if the player fell underwater. The item was removed from the game a few months out from release, as the developers deemed it too similar to the Lightning Shield, which too protected against attacks and disappeared after coming into contact with water, but also had the benefit of attracting nearby rings. The Flame Shields that were built into the game appear to have been replaced by Lightning Shields, if a leaked prototype from September 97 is any indication, as the Lightning Shields in this version share the same colour graphic as the Flame Shield, but do attract rings. One noticeable difference between earlier prototypes and later builds is the appearance of Dr. Robotnik's Eggmobile ship. Its undercarriage once sported a large black and red missile with a mischievous grinning face. It was eventually altered to a grey cannon due to impracticalities presented by the original design. The developers would have had to animate the missile detaching from the underside of Robotnik's vehicle and a new one appearing in its place, something John Burton said their engine was not set up to support on the Sega Saturn. That's why in prototypes with the older design, Robotnik's missile cannot actually fire. The final design, which was much simpler, also had the benefit of trimming the model's polygon count. Another significant change to weaponry in the game concerns Amy's car. Originally, it was going to be able to produce a large spinning saw blade to attack racers in front of her. This was seen as a way to put her on par with Robotnik, who was planned to have an offensive maneuver of his own, but it was ultimately vetoed for being too violent. Across the board, the initial prototype models for Sonic R were more detailed than those in the finished product. Many of them received numerous minor adjustments, usually to keep them in line with polygon quotas for the sake of performance. Tails once had 3D whiskers and strands of hair that stuck out. Amy's car included a spoiler on the rear. Knuckles had more defined dreadlocks using more polygons which hung down his back more, and an alternate colour scheme for his shoes featuring orange, which was closer to his appearance in Sonic 3 and Knuckles. These older renders were used in select promotional material in the run-up to release, and even appeared in the game's instruction manual. Metal Sonic, on the other hand, once had a more detailed jet engine on his back, and the Egg Robo 2 sported a jetpack that was originally split into 2 separate parts, but was later merged into one. Throughout 1997, Sonic R appeared on multiple occasions in Sega Video Magazine, a series of promotional VHS tapes sent out to advertise new and upcoming Sega products in Japan. The footage used in these tapes includes unfinished versions of Tails and Knuckles, distinguishable by the blue aura around them when jumping. This indicates that they must have been newly added to the game, as the developers had yet to alter the aura from Sonic's blue to their respective orange and red colours. These clips are also notable for featuring an alternate version of the game's main musical theme, Super Sonic Racing. While the final song was performed by TJ Davis, this iteration, which had different instrumentation, was sung by another artist.
Sonic R は5800円で12月4日発売予定です。
This version of the song also appeared at E397 and could be heard during gameplay on the Resort Island stage. To learn more about this mysterious track, I spoke to the composer of Sonic R's soundtrack, Richard Jacques, who explained its origins in full. Quote, "This was a work-in-progress version of Super Sonic Racing. The singer is a lady who used to work in the Sega Europe offices, and I used her to create a demo of the song for Yuji Naka to listen to and approve. This is often what takes place before spending financial resources on studio time with session singers/musicians. Richard added that he did not have a copy of it himself. In the beginning, it was not Yuji Naka's intention for each level's music to include vocals. According to Richard Jacques and TJ Davis, they were initially only contracted to produce Super Sonic Racing as a title theme, but the song was received so warmly by Naka that he decided the rest of the soundtrack should follow suit. John Burton has said that he was concerned about how audiences would respond to this direction at first, and therefore decided to build in an option to turn the vocals off. He even planned at one point that they would be disabled by default, and instrumental versions would play instead. Over time, however, he grew to like the vocal tracks, so much so that he decided they would be turned on by default in the final game. As 1997 went on, Traveller's Tales continued interacting with the press, providing up-to-date information as the project raced towards the finish line. Tips and Tricks magazine was one such outlet to cover the game, and in September 97, they reported on 2 different gameplay modes that ultimately didn't make it into the release game. Quote, "A variety of gameplay modes are available: Ring Attack, Relay Race, and even Tag. The only one of those to actually be realized in the end was Tag, wherein the player must bump into different computer-controlled races to win. Whereas the elusive Ring Attack was never again mentioned in future previews, Relay Race continued to be teased." In the October 97 edition of Sega Saturn magazine, John Burton mentions some of the planned game types, and his choice of words reveals how unsure he was of Relay Race's inclusion at the time. Quote, "There will be a 2-player mode, including race and battle modes hopefully, as well as time trial, tag, and possibly relay modes." This was one of the last times the relay mode was mentioned, and for many years, over 2 decades in fact, what this would have entailed remained uncertain. That was until June 2018 when John Burton revealed via YouTube that it would have seen the player choosing a few different characters and taking turns controlling each throughout the race. As the player finished one lap, they would pass over to the next character and so on until the race concluded. John wasn't completely sure of why it was dropped, but speculated the game's tech simply wasn't set up to do character swapping of this nature. Time constraints may have also played a role, given how the developers had a strict deadline for Sonic R to be on sale in time for the 1997 holiday period. This may also explain the absence of another mode teased in magazines at the time, called Mirror Mode. Like the mode of the same name from the Mario Kart series, this would have reflected each track, challenging the player's knowledge of each course with this added twist. A mirror mode appearing in Sonic R was mentioned in a couple of different previews, including the aforementioned Sega Saturn magazine write-up from October 97. John Burton believes that it was never finished primarily because its implementation would have slowed down the game's polygon draw code. Its removal is just another reminder of the delicate balance Traveller's Tales had to strike as they attempted to work within the Saturn's hardware limitations. In the final months before launch, a mock-up of the game's cover was sent out to media outlets and toy catalogs featuring different art from that which later showed up on store shelves. A version of this art also functioned as the title screen in prototypes. The original render seen here was drawn in a 2D style more in line with other Sonic covers from this era, but was eventually redesigned. What replaced it was a completely different take on the material with 3D visuals. John Burton has said that he much prefers the original rendition, and that Sega had it redone to avoid spoiling the presence of Metal Sonic, a secret unlockable character who could be seen on the older cover. The original box art does briefly appear in the final game, however, at the end of the credits, with the phrase "See ya" placed over it. The high-resolution 3D models of characters and levels took multiple days to render, according to Burton. The Silicon Graphics computers which produced them cost $30,000 each, using software packages worth $20,000 back in 1997. Some minor differences can be observed between the final courses and these renders, such as in the case of Regal Ruin. In the finished version, pillars were later added into the pool of water to the right of the start line, for example. Through examining earlier builds and previews, we can see that each level in the game had a single word working title during development. Resort Island was Island, Radical City was City, Regal Ruin was Ruin, and according to the November 97 edition of Saturn Power magazine, Reactive Factory was originally referred to as Industrial, before being changed to Factory. Each was later given a title starting with the letter R to match the game's namesake. We can mine further changes from a prototype shared by Hidden Palace dated September 1997, which contains 3 different levels: Island, City, and Factory, the last of which is still very unfinished. The differences between it and the release build are manifold. The prototype has different menus which are static and include the older high poly renders of the characters. Different loading screens featuring a disc with a reflection of the original title screen art. The race countdown timer sound is different, and its text reads 3, 2, 1, go, which was later changed to Ready, Set, Go, with a line voiced by TJ Davis. The countdown text is partially transparent in the prototype and a darker shade of blue. Sonic uses his idle animation on the start line, whereas in the final game he stands still. All AI characters receive a speed boost at the start of each race in the prototype, meaning the player always starts in last place and must catch them up. Each course was intended at this point to contain 9 separate coins to collect, as opposed to the 5 in the finish game. Some are hidden in places where coins aren't present in the final version. In Resort Island, for instance, one is next to the huts, another can be found among the pine trees. The ring gates, which grant access to alternate routes, required a high amount of rings in the prototype. The Chaos Emeralds were originally a different, taller shape with a point at the top. Sonic's idle animation was different. The icons on the left of the screen, as well as sporting different designs, work slightly differently. In this version, the character in first place has a larger icon, while in the final build, the player's icon is always bigger than the others to highlight your position more effectively. If Sonic finishes a race in either 4th or 5th place, he will sometimes burst into tears in the prototype, but this was later removed. Radical City's start line is further forward, closer to the archway, and the characters begin much closer to each other. Likewise, the start position for Reactive Factory was further down the course, closer to these 2 slopes. The level also has a metal floor surrounding it in the distance, which was replaced with water in the final version. The first alternate route you encounter in this course has a slightly different design here. The entrance to the spring room was situated at the front of the metal spire, whereas in the release build it's found around the back of it and takes slightly longer to access. It's also surrounded by water in the prototype that the player can fall into, whereas this water is blocked off by fencing in the final. When AI characters complete the race before you in the prototype, they will wait for you on the finish line. In the final build, they will instead continue doing laps of the track until the race is over. Then there are elements of the prototype that are simply unfinished. The minimap, for instance, doesn't yet track the positions of characters throughout the stages. The arrows instructing players where to go haven't yet been implemented. Robotnik's hands are missing from his victory pose. The replay feature is broken and often sends your character bumping into walls and falling into water. Some of the alternate routes in the factory level are incomplete. Doors where coins are hidden in the final game cannot be opened, and the path to the Chaos Emerald aboard the submarine is partly obscured. On the other hand, it's notable how much of the game was nailed down by this point. Even small elements like Easter eggs are in place, such as one planted there by John Burton personally. He included an ichthys, a symbol which is said to have been employed by Christians to discreetly identify other members of the church amid the persecution of the Roman Empire. The symbol was often placed on doors of homes and churches. In Sonic R, it can be found on one of the huts in Resort Island, a nod to Burton's religious beliefs. According to John, Sega was fully aware of the symbol's presence in the game and did not object to it. Despite having around only 9 months, Traveller's Tales was able to meet their tight deadline and finish the game in time for the 1997 holidays. Hirokazu Yasuhara, who was initially unsure of the project's potential when he joined the team, later expressed a degree of appreciation for it. Quote, "I think that, although I only joined the project in the middle, the final version of Sonic R is actually quite good. I understand that it is difficult to reverse negative impressions on the game after it receives bad reviews at E3. People do not play or buy it, so they cannot change their opinions. However, I do admit that the base concept of Sonic R, in which the player drives running characters, is not great." Sonic R was first released in November 1997, but that might not have been the case were it not for the actions of one person in particular. Kat Sato, who was overseeing the project on Sega's behalf at Traveller's Tales, revealed in an interview with French blog Terre de Jeu that he got into a heated disagreement with Yuji Naka over the game's content. Naka had requested more additions to the game, but with the schedule already tight, Sato told him that it could not be done, leading to an intense argument. So impassioned was this dispute that Sato, who had previously been a prominent public figurehead for the game, no longer even wanted his name associated with it. He chose to have his name excluded from the in-game credits. I asked John Burton to give his side of what happened. Quote, "I know Kat had his credit removed from the game, which is a real shame, as he was a great supporter of the studio. I have no idea if he lost his credit because he was protecting us from some of the changes, or if he was perhaps standing up for some of the design decisions we made. Either way, I'm pretty sure it was for supporting us." This was eventually corrected when Sonic R was ported to PC 1 year later. In that release, Sato was credited as the project director, and in the years since has publicly discussed his work on it. Still, it's worth remarking on the fact that if you played the original version of Sonic R, the project director, one of the people most responsible for shaping it into what it is today, is not credited for it at all. Sonic R received mixed to positive reviews upon launch. Critics praised its level design and visuals, while opinion was divided over its soundtrack and short length. Despite this division, the game has remained beloved by a passionate sect of the Sonic fanbase. 20 years on from release, John Burton began sharing fresh insights from its development, showcasing prototypes and material he had been able to preserve. His YouTube channel Game Hut has offered fans a rare look behind the curtain of Traveller's Tales and into the creation of some of its past titles. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos just like this one. If you'd like to support my work and allow me to keep making more of these, check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/LiamRobertson, just like these kind people did.